Hi, I'm Joy Axelson. In this lecture for Philippians, we're going to be looking a bit more at chapters 1 and 2. I want to help you understand a couple of the difficult passages and give you a bit more background information to help you understand. So as you look at Philippians 1, I want you to notice the atmosphere that shows the close relationship between Paul and the original reader. For example, where he uses words like partner or partakers, like in Philippians chapter 1, verse 5 and 7. We see the inclusion of Paul and the original readers together. Also the repeated words all, always, and every. Again, to show where Paul is wanting to emphasize the importance of unity, inclusion. Also think about, why does Paul start the letter just saying that he's a servant? He doesn't talk about his apostleship. And also think about why in chapter 1 verse 2, why does he mention the leadership? He doesn't do that in most of his other letters. So now I want to look at a couple of specific verses in chapter 1 and 2. So first of all, in chapter 1 verses 12 through 18, he's giving a report to the original readers of his imprisonment. Most likely they've heard about his imprisonment and they were concerned about his welfare and how he's doing in prison. So let's read verse 12 through 15. And I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard, and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having been confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, as much more being bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach the gospel from envy and rivalry, but others for the good news. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of rivalry, not sincerely, but thinking of afflicting me in my imprisonment. So I read on to verse 17. So in verse 12 here, when Paul has the words advance the gospel, that is also a military term that talks about the movement of troops in a difficult environment or difficult geographical location by means of sending advancing troops to remove the barriers. And so here Paul gives specific evidence to show how the gospel is advancing. Number 1, he shows that the gospel is being known to all the imperial guards and all around. Number 2, that there are brothers who have become more confident to proclaim the gospel. And thirdly, that the gospel is being proclaimed. Then we come to these people in verse 15. They seem to be jealous Christian preachers. And these cause great debate among the commentators. Saying who are these people? But it seemed quite evidence from verses 11 to 18 that they were truly preaching about Jesus, but they had the wrong motives. Whereas they were preaching to hurt Paul, but they were still preaching the true gospel, not false doctrine. Because, in all the other letters that you've done, like Galatians, whenever Paul sees false doctrine, he's very strong and direct with dealing with it. And we don't see him doing that here. So I think we can to identify here that they are preaching the true gospel, but they're preaching with the wrong, selfish, jealous motives to make trouble for Paul. So now I want to look at the unity passage at the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. So let's read chapter 1, verse 27 through 30. Only let your matter of life be worthy of the gospel, so that whether I come and see you or absent, I may hear of that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened at anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that for God. For it has granted to you for the sake of Christ that you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake, engaging in the same conflict that you have saw that I have, and now hear that I still have. So what Paul is saying here in the phrase, the manner of your life, from verse 27, let the manner of your life be worthy of the gospel. If you look in your footnote, if you have the ESV translation, that it can be translated as only behave as citizens worthy of the gospel. So here Paul is picking up the same idea of their pride of their Roman citizenship. That Paul reminds them that they're not only citizens of Rome, but they're citizens of heaven. And they are to be consistent in their way of living in unity, whether Paul is with them or whether he's not. So how do they show that they are living in unity in the way that is worthy of the gospel? That's by living in unity, standing firm together, standing in opposition standing together against the opposition in unity and in faith. Philippians chapter 1 verse 28 is the first time that Paul mentions the opposition, and we will talk more about it when we look at chapter 3. But he tells them not to be afraid, that God will deal with their enemies, and that they need to continue enduring for the sake of the gospel. In verse 29 and 30, he talks about how suffering is a part of Christianity. It is a part of the gospel, that suffering for Christ. Just as Paul was suffering in the past and is now suffering, so they should also expect to suffer. Then we come to chapter 2, and let's read verse 1 through 4. So if there is any encouragement in Christ, if there is any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from rivalry or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each one of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. So here Paul is connecting living in unity and summarizes it, how to do it in these verses. So in verses 1, he shows how they are to live in unity. You see there is a conditional statement, if. So there's 4 things that he lists here: that they live in encouragement in Christ, that they have comfort from love, they participate in the Spirit, and they have affection and sympathy. And this will complete Paul's joy. And then on in verse 3 and 4, he shows how they are to have unity. And that's by regarding others more significant than themselves, and looking out for the interest of others, to think of others more significant than themselves. And this is the definition of humility, is thinking of others. And then on in Philippians chapter 2, verse 5 through 11, the author goes on and explains and uses Christ as the ultimate example of humility. Some think that this is a psalm or a hymn from the early church. There's much debate is it a hymn or is it not? Did Paul write it? Did he not? But the main point of this, whether Paul wrote it or not, if it was a hymn or not, is it shows again that Christ is the ultimate example of humility. So let's read verse 5 through 8. Have this mind among yourselves, which is in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. Having been formed in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. Okay, so here Paul is using an illustration for the original reader how they are to have the same mind in Christ. through Christ's own personal example. Paul illustrates how Jesus' example of this same mind is not one of rivalry or contempt, but of humility, considering others more than himself. So this same mind, having the same mind in Christ, is very important for the original reader. And Paul illustrates how Jesus does this by in the following verses, by looking at Jesus' incarnation and his death. So there's two parts of this description of Jesus in Philippians chapter 2, verse 5 through 11. The first part is from Philippians chapter 2, verse 6 through 8, where we see Jesus' humiliation, where Jesus as God is pouring himself out by taking the form of a slave and a servant through becoming human, and then as a human he humbled himself by dying on the cross, and he became obedient by dying on the cross. The second part is Philippians chapter 2, verse 9 through 11, and we see Jesus' exaltation. Philippians chapter 2, verse 9 starts with the connective therefore, and in these verses we see that it is God in action, where God exalts Jesus to the highest place of honor. So to help the original reader understand this godly mindset, Paul gives an example of Jesus' incarnation and crucifixion to show them how they, like Jesus, can live in unity without rivalry or conceit, and consider others in humility. Jesus' motives, again we said, were not from rivalry or conceit, because even though he was God, he came as a servant, as a human. He considered others in humility by humbling himself to death on the cross for others. So Paul is saying, you original readers, you need to have the same attitude as God himself, which is illustrated through the incarnation and death of Jesus. This mindset is always found in Christ and is historically shown in his incarnation. So Jesus was the ultimate example of humility for the original reader. They are to take his attitude, to be Christ-like in their thoughts and their actions. They need a change in their mindset to be like Jesus. Jesus, he was his pre-existent divine glory, and he became human for others, and he died for the sake of others, not for himself. And so the original reader are to follow Jesus' self-sacrificing, self-giving example. So that is the context that we're looking at from Philippians 6, verse 7, chapter 2, verse 6 through 7. Because there's much debate and much different interpretation of this. So we want to now look specifically at these verses. So in verse 6, where it talks about, though he was in the form of God, he did not count equality with God as a thing to be grasped. It's important to understand that Jesus was already fully God as the pre-existing Christ. Before he came on earth as man, he was fully God. And he was completely God through his entire incarnation, death, and resurrection. The form of God in the Greek means to form or shape. So in Philippians chapter 2, verse 6, where Jesus was in the form of God, we also see in verse 8 that he was found in human form. So we have that same word there, where Paul is emphasizing that Jesus is both God and man. And then in verse 6, we also have the phrase, a thing to be grasped. Grasp here comes from the Greek, which can mean a matter of grasping, to seize, or to steal. Or it can also mean something to be grasped, to take for one's own advantage. So we see that Jesus did not take or grasp his position as being equal with God, his Godhead, to be used for his own selfish reasons. But he even rejected the Jewish expectation of the Messiah, that the Messiah would come as a physical king in all his glory to save them. But what did he do? He came in the form of a servant. He came unselfishly. Then in verse 7, in the ESV, it says that he made himself nothing. But in other translations, it says that he emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant. So there's several theories as to what it means that Jesus emptied himself. So I'm going to give you two main ones. The first one is that Jesus chose to live as a human. He voluntarily left his divine glory and accepted the limitations of the flesh. He was still had greater insight and spiritual power than the ordinary man, but he was all that humans were intended to be. The second interpretation was that Jesus did not become less than God in his incarnation, but he added humanity to his deity. He left the outward glory of deity, and he took the outward form of man. So this involved addition, not subtraction. During Jesus' earthly ministry, he was filled and empowered by the Spirit, and he was, of course, he knew and revealed the Father. There's too many interpretations that emphasizes that Jesus emptied himself of something, but in a sense, he really did not empty himself of anything. He just poured himself out by taking on the form of a slave. Like when you pour out water, which I'll pour in my mouth. It's a picture of that, in the sense that Jesus here is God's selflessness of self-giving for others, that Jesus did not enter into human history as the king or Lord, but he entered as a slave, without advantages, without rights or privileges that he had a right to. He was God, but he came selfishly. He came as a slave or servant. And so Paul shows a strong contrast between Jesus in the form of God and the form of a servant to really show this. Jesus didn't stop being God when he was human. He was God living as a man. For the original reader, Paul illustrates how Jesus poured himself out for the sake of others in humility by becoming a slave. That he not only shows God's character, but what it means to live out the mind of Christ. That's what he was talking about in verse 5, having this mind among you, which is in Christ Jesus. So the climax of Paul's illustration here is verse 8, Jesus' death on the cross. So it's the worst kind of death in the Roman Empire. And Jesus humbled himself by being obedient to death, which implies that Jesus chose himself to humble himself. He chose obedience. He didn't have to come to earth as a man. He didn't have to go to the cross, but he did. Jesus, who is God himself, showed truth about who God is, that God is love, and that God has chosen in his love, his self-sacrifice, cruel, humiliating death on the cross to save those that he loves. So this is an example that Paul gives the original reader of how they can live out the mind of Christ. That they can live out what they have in Christ, their attitudes and relationships with others. That Jesus is the ultimate example of humility and obedience. Paul ends by showing in verses 9 through 11 that it was God who exalted Jesus, and it was not Jesus doing that himself. Wow, I hope you really take some time to meditate on these verses. They are very powerful and very important in understanding what Jesus has done for us and what the ultimate example of humility and servitude for all of us and for the original reader. You know, true humility is motivated by true love. And that's what the Philippians needed to have for each other, is the kind of love. And it's the kind of love that we need to have. That's the gospel. That is the ultimate truth that unifies. That if the gospel is our focus and others are our focus like it was for Jesus, then we can be unified. That's what we need, that we can live and walk in humility. So I really want you to take some time to think and consider, what does it really mean to consider others better than ourselves? How do we view others who are different than us? How do we view if you're in school, your classmates, or if you work, your co-workers? How does God view them? How does God really view them? What would it look like if you lived in humility in your own life and ministry? What would it look like? What would be different? How would you change your work or church environment if you acted and lived in humility? Who is it difficult to love that you can think of? Who is an individual that's difficult to love in humility? So take time to think and pray about this as you work through this book. So lastly in this session, I want to look at one more difficult verse, which is in verse 12, chapter 2, verse 12 and 13. And it's, therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure. So we see that in verse 12 that it starts out with the therefore. So it's connected to Jesus' example that's listed before. So the context before is, we saw Jesus as obedient in humility. So the original reader, they are also to live in humility. And Paul has encouraged them to live in this obedience. And the context right after these verses are that they are to be lights in the midst of the world, that they are to be an example for non-believers through their lifestyle. So we come to the phrase, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And here some people emphasize, well, that means that you have to work out. It's works salvation. But it's important to observe the connection between the original readers' responsibility to work out their salvation in verse 12, but yet also God's responsibility that God works in them to will and to do of his good pleasure in verse 13. So here it's not talking about individual salvation. We know that salvation does not come by works. It's a free gift. It's only by grace and God's mercy, and that we receive it by faith. But here it's emphasizing on the whole church of Philippi, that the you here is plural, that they are to live out their salvation in obedience in Jesus. So this is the practical working out of what they believe, what they received in their salvation, and working it out through their lifestyle and living in unity. And with the idea of the fear and trembling means that it's serious business. But again, the emphasis is in verse 13 that it is God who works in them. It's not that God leaves them alone to work out their sanctification themselves, but it is he who empowers them to be able to live it out. God is the one who wills, who gives them the want to. And it's God who gives them the ability to live out their sanctification of their salvation. And Paul, through the rest of this chapter, he gives two examples of people who live in humility in verses 19 through 30 of chapter 2. He gives an example of Timothy and Epaphroditus. So take time to observe, how does Paul describe these two men? See their heart and their focus of service for others. Think about, why does Paul give them the examples of these guys? Why is it important for the original reader? Especially, why did Paul use Epaphroditus? How he is from the Philippi church. The original reader knew him personally. He was like from the kid next door. And Paul describes how he almost died for the sake of the gospel. So if he can live and walk in unity, so can they. So this should encourage us as well, that God has called us to live and walk in humility, and by humbly loving other people, that we can walk in unity and we can impact and change our environment by doing this. It's not a lot of people think, well, living in unity, especially for the church and the different denominations and different people thinking different ways, how on earth is the church going to be unified? But if we all walk in unity and follow Jesus' example, it is possible. So that's the end of this lecture. Thank you.